74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, an event occurred that nearly destroyed humanity. Not war, not disease, a volcano. It ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash into the atmosphere, 10,000 times larger than the greatest eruption in recorded human history. The sky darkened for years. Temperatures dropped by 8 to 17 degrees Celsius. Vegetation died. Animals went extinct. And the population of Homo sapiens, our entire species, was reduced to a number of people that would fit comfortably inside a small stadium. We know this because it is written in every cell of your body. Your DNA carries the genetic memory of this catastrophe. You exist because your ancestors survived the darkest moment in the history of our species. Before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel. Your support really helps us to continue our work. Thank you. To understand the scale of what happened 74,000 years ago, you need a reference point. In April of 1815, the Tambora volcano on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa erupted in what remains the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. Tambora ejected approximately 160 cubic kilometers of material, less than 6% of what Toba would produce. And the consequences were catastrophic on a global scale. The eruption killed an estimated 71,000 people in its immediate vicinity through pyroclastic flows, ashfall, and the tsunami it triggered. But the secondary effects were worse than the direct ones. The ash and sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere by Tambora reflected sunlight back into space, reducing global temperatures by approximately 1 degree Celsius and disrupting weather patterns across the entire northern hemisphere. The following year, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. In New England, snow fell in June. In Europe, harvests failed across the continent. Famines spread from Ireland to China. Lord Byron, sheltering from the relentless rain in a villa on Lake Geneva, wrote his poem Darkness, describing a world where the sun had gone out. Mary Shelley, at the same villa for the same reason, began writing Frankenstein. One volcanic eruption, 160 cubic kilometers, produced a year of global disruption, widespread famine, and the most famous horror novel in literary history. The Toba eruption was 10,000 times larger. Not 10 times, not 100 times. 10,000 times the volume of material ejected by Tambora. 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash launched into the stratosphere in what geologists call the youngest Toba Tuff event, the most recent of 4 major eruptions at the Toba site, and by far the most catastrophic. If Tambora produced a year without a summer, what did Toba produce? The answer, according to climate models, is a volcanic winter, lasting not 1 year, but potentially 3 to 6 years. Years in which the sky was perpetually dimmed, in which global temperatures fell by amounts that in different regions ranged from 3 to 17 degrees Celsius, below the already cool baseline of the Ice Age world, in which the killing frost moved south and the productive growing regions of Africa and Asia were devastated by cold, drought, and the collapse of the food webs on which human and animal populations depended. Before the eruption, the world of 74,000 years ago was already populated by several kinds of human. It is important to establish this clearly because the Toba story is not simply a story about one species in one place. It is a story about the competition and coexistence of multiple hominin lineages across the Old World, and the Toba eruption's role in determining which of those lineages survived to become the ancestors of everyone alive today. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals had been the dominant hominid for more than 300,000 years. They were not primitive brutes, the caricature that 19th century science produced and that popular culture has been slow to abandon. Neanderthals buried their dead, cared for their sick and injured, used ochre and other pigments, made jewelry from eagle talons and shells, and in some regions appeared to have produced art. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than those of modern Homo sapiens. They had adapted over hundreds of thousands of years to the cold, challenging environments of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, developing a robust, stocky body plan well suited to retaining heat, and a stone tool technology, the Mousterian, of considerable sophistication. They were, in every meaningful sense, people. In the Far East, in what is now China and Southeast Asia, other archaic human lineages were present. The Denisovans, known primarily from genetic evidence and a handful of fragmentary fossils from Siberia and Tibet, appear to have occupied a broad swath of Asia, and to have been widespread enough that their genetic descendants can be detected today in indigenous populations of Melanesia, Australia, and the Philippines, who carry approximately 3 to 5% Denisovan DNA. In Southeast Asia itself, the diminutive Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, whose small brain and small body represent an extreme adaptation to island life, was still present on the island of Flores until approximately 50,000 years ago, potentially surviving through the Toba event. And then there was Homo sapiens. Our species had evolved in Africa by at least 300,000 years ago, and by 74,000 years ago, we were present across a broad swath of the African continent, from the Mediterranean coast to the Cape of Good Hope, and had begun making tentative forays out of Africa into the Levant and possibly southern Arabia. We were anatomically modern, recognizably like the people you see around you today. But behaviorally, we were still developing the full suite of cognitive and cultural capabilities that would eventually define human modernity. The stone tools we used were sophisticated, but not yet consistently microlithic. Long-distance trade networks existed, but were not yet the dense, complex webs that would develop later. Symbolic behavior, ochre use, shell ornaments, geometric engravings, was present but sporadic rather than universal. This was the world that existed on the eve of the Toba eruption, a world of several human species, a world in which the outcome of the competition between lineages was not yet determined, a world in which the survival of any particular group of Homo sapiens was far from guaranteed. The Toba eruption did not occur in a world populated solely by our ancestors. It occurred in a world where our ancestors were one of several players in a complex hominin drama. And the eruption's role in thinning, isolating, and ultimately reshaping those populations would determine, in ways that are still being worked out by researchers today, which lineages survived and which did not. The experience of the Toba eruption would have been profoundly different depending on where you were when it happened. For the people of Sumatra and the immediately surrounding islands, the eruption was total and immediate annihilation. No warning system, no evacuation, no preparation could have helped. The pyroclastic flows moved at velocities that no human could outrun, at temperatures that incinerated everything in their path. The landscape of Sumatra was erased. Everything within several hundred kilometers of the eruption center, every plant, every animal, every human being, was gone within hours. For people living in India, several thousand kilometers from the eruption center, but within the zone of heavy ashfall, the experience unfolded over days. The ash arrived not as an immediate wall of fire, but as a gradually thickening grey haze in the sky, a dimming of the sun, and then the steady fall of grey and white ash that accumulated on the ground, on the leaves, on the water. The ash would have coated everything within range to depths of several centimeters to several meters, smothering vegetation, contaminating water sources, and making the air increasingly difficult to breathe. Animals that could not move fast enough to escape the ashfall would have died where they stood, their bodies buried under the accumulating grey blanket. People who survived the immediate ashfall would have found themselves in a landscape stripped of food, water, and shelter. For people living in Africa, the experience was different again, more diffuse, more gradual, more survivable in the immediate term, but devastating in its slow accumulation. The ash that reached Africa was predominantly cryptotephra, microscopic particles invisible to the naked eye, settling invisibly on the vegetation and entering the food and water chain without the dramatic visible spectacle of heavy ashfall. What the African populations experienced was not the sudden horror of the Indian populations, but something stranger and more disorienting. A sky that grew steadily paler and colder, a sun that lost its warmth, rains that became increasingly erratic, and a gradual, inexplicable deterioration of the environment in which they had lived their entire lives. The animals that formed their prey base began to disappear. The plants that provided their vegetable foods failed to fruit and flower on their normal schedules. The children born in the years after the eruption grew up in a colder, darker, more uncertain world than the one their parents had known. The years of volcanic winter, the period of maximum atmospheric cooling when the stratospheric aerosol veil was thickest, would have tested human resilience in ways that no subsequent generation has experienced. The cold alone, pushing temperatures in tropical Africa perhaps 5 to 10 degrees below the already cool glacial baseline, would have been physiologically challenging for populations adapted to warmer conditions. But the cold was only the beginning. The disruption of the monsoon system, the vast atmospheric circulation that delivers rainfall to much of Africa and Asia, and that is highly sensitive to changes in the temperature differential between land and ocean, would have altered rainfall patterns unpredictably, bringing drought to regions that normally received reliable rain and flooding to regions that were normally dry. The resulting collapse of plant productivity would have cascaded through the food web, devastating the populations of the large herbivores that human hunters depended on, and leaving behind only the most resilient and adaptable species. The generalists, the small-bodied scavengers, the organisms that could tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. It was in this context that the surviving human populations, those who had been far enough from the eruption to survive the immediate effects, and tough enough and lucky enough to survive the years of volcanic winter, began the process of adaptation that would eventually produce modern behavioral complexity. The physical scale of the Toba eruption is difficult to absorb even when you know the numbers. The eruption created a caldera. The collapsed depression left when a volcanic magma chamber empties, and the overlying crust collapses inward. that measured approximately 100 kilometers by 30 kilometers. To stand at one end of the Toba caldera and look toward the other would be like standing in New York City and trying to see Philadelphia. Today, this caldera is filled with water. Lake Toba, the largest volcanic lake in the world, is so large that it contains a large island, Samosir Island, roughly the size of Singapore, formed by the gradual uplift of the caldera floor by the still active magmatic system beneath it. When tourists visit Lake Toba today to enjoy its cool mountain air and scenic highland landscape, they are standing inside the scar left by an event that 74,000 years ago nearly ended their species. The geological mechanism that produced Toba is rooted in the same plate tectonic setting that makes Indonesia one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth. The Indo-Australian plate, moving northward at approximately 56 millimeters per year, dives beneath the Sunda Arc, the chain of islands and submarine ridges that forms the backbone of the Indonesian archipelago. In the process, geologists call subduction. As the oceanic crust of the Indo-Australian plate descends into the hot mantle beneath the Sunda Arc, it carries with it water locked in hydrated minerals. At depth, under the enormous pressures and temperatures of the subduction zone, this water is released from the descending slab and rises into the overlying mantle wedge. Water lowers the melting point of rock, causing the mantle to partially melt and generating magma, the liquid rock that eventually drives volcanic eruptions. At most subduction zone volcanoes, this magma reaches the surface relatively quickly, producing the tall, steep-sided stratovolcanoes that characterize the Pacific Ring of Fire. Mountains like Krakatoa and Merapi and Mount Pinatubo, capable of producing massive explosive eruptions, but not on a scale that threatens the survival of entire species. What makes Toba different? What makes Toba a supervolcano rather than simply a very large volcano is the exceptional size and exceptional silica content of its magma reservoir. The magma that fed the Toba eruption was extraordinarily rich in silica, making it viscous and gas-rich. Silica-rich magma does not flow easily. It traps the volcanic gases, primarily water vapor and sulfur dioxide, that would otherwise escape gradually through the porous rock of the volcanic edifice. Instead, the gas pressure builds. The magma accumulates in an enormous subsurface reservoir, and the system builds toward a paroxysmal release of energy that dwarfs anything produced by the more fluid, lower silica magmas of basaltic volcanoes. The magma chamber beneath Toba is believed to have accumulated over tens of thousands of years before the eruption, filling a subsurface reservoir of enormous volume with viscous, gas-saturated magma at extreme pressure. Research published in the Journal of Volcanology and Geothermal Research in 2025, analyzing volcanic deposits from marine sediment cores drilled off the northern coast of Sumatra, found evidence that volcanic activity at the Toba complex had been ongoing for at least 50,000 years before the main eruption event, suggesting that the eruption represented not a sudden awakening, but the culmination of a prolonged build-up. The magmatic system was not simply a bomb waiting to go off. It was a geological process of extraordinary duration that eventually reached the threshold at which the accumulated pressure could no longer be contained by the overlying crust. When the eruption finally occurred, 74,000 years ago, the sequence of events would have unfolded with a violence that no modern human being has ever witnessed, and that no historical record captures. The initial phase was likely a violent explosive eruption from one or more vent systems, sending a column of ash, gas, and fragmented magma into the stratosphere at supersonic velocities. The eruption column at its peak may have reached heights of 50 kilometers or more, far above the weather systems of the troposphere, penetrating deep into the stratosphere where the fine ash particles and sulfur dioxide gases would be swept around the globe on stratospheric winds. As the eruption continued and the magma reservoir emptied, the overlying crust lost its structural support and began to collapse inward, generating the pyroclastic flows, avalanches of hot gas, ash, and rock fragments moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour at temperatures of several hundred degrees Celsius. That constitute the most immediately lethal product of supervolcanic eruptions. The pyroclastic flows from Toba would have devastated everything within hundreds of kilometers of the eruption in minutes. No organism within this radius could have survived. The Sumatran landscape was erased. But the pyroclastic flows, catastrophic as they were a local phenomenon. It was the stratospheric injection of ash and sulfur dioxide that carried the Toba eruption's consequences to the entire planet. Sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere reacts with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols, tiny droplets of sulfuric acid suspended in the upper atmosphere. These aerosols scatter incoming solar radiation back into space, reducing the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth's surface. The sulfate aerosols from Tambora in 1815 persisted in the stratosphere for approximately 2 to 3 years before settling out of the atmosphere and washing out of the stratospheric reservoir. The sulfur dioxide injection from Toba is estimated to have been orders of magnitude larger than Tambora's, producing a stratospheric aerosol veil of sufficient thickness and persistence to reduce solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface for multiple years. Climate models using the best available estimates of the Toba eruption's magnitude produce surface temperature cooling of between 8 and 17 degrees Celsius globally, with the most severe cooling occurring in the years immediately following the eruption and gradually diminishing over 3 to 6 years as the aerosols settled out of the stratosphere. 8 to 17 degrees Celsius of cooling on a global average is not a subtle climatic perturbation. For context, the difference between the average global temperature during the depths of the last ice age and the relatively warm climate of today is approximately 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. The Toba cooling event, in the worst climate model scenarios, produced a temperature drop 3 times greater than the entire difference between an ice age world and an interglacial world, in a matter of years rather than thousands of years. The effects of this rapid cooling on ecosystems that had evolved under stable ice age conditions would have been catastrophic. The world of 74,000 years ago was already a glacial world. The last glacial period was well underway, with ice sheets covering significant portions of the northern hemisphere and global temperatures already several degrees cooler than today. Forests were already restricted to lower latitudes and lower altitudes compared to interglacial periods. The productive savanna and woodland ecosystems of Africa and southern Asia, the environments where Homo sapiens populations were concentrated, were already under stress from the Ice Age climate. The Toba eruptions struck this already stressed world with the force of a secondary hammer blow, pushing temperatures beyond the tolerance limits of ecosystems that were already operating at the margins of viability. The ash fall itself, independent of the stratospheric cooling, caused devastation on a continental scale. The youngest Toba tuff ash layer is preserved in sedimentary sequences across an enormous area, from the South China Sea to the Arabian Peninsula, from the Indian subterranean sequences to the deep-sea sediments of the Indian Ocean. In some locations in India and Malaysia, ash deposits from the Toba eruption reach thicknesses of several meters, thick enough to smother vegetation, contaminate water sources, and render large areas uninhabitable for years or decades after the eruption. The acid rain generated by the sulfur dioxide emissions would have poisoned freshwater sources across an enormous area. The toxic gases released directly from the eruption, including hydrogen fluoride and hydrogen chloride, would have caused fluorosis and other toxic effects in animals consuming contaminated vegetation or water. The evidence for the global reach of the Toba eruption has been dramatically strengthened in recent years by research using cryptotephra, microscopic volcanic glass shards invisible to the naked eye that can be extracted from sediment sequences using chemical techniques. These cryptotephra particles carry geochemical fingerprints that can be traced back to their source volcano, allowing researchers to detect the presence of Toba ash in locations where no macroscopic ash layer is visible. Research published in September of 2025, led by an international team working on archaeological sites in the Horn of Africa and published in the journal Science Advances, used cryptotephra analysis to identify Toba glass shards in sediment sequences from multiple sites in Ethiopia and Djibouti, locations approximately 6,000 kilometers from the Toba eruption center. The presence of cryptotephra at these sites confirms that the Toba eruption's atmospheric fallout reached the Horn of Africa, a region of critical importance for understanding the impact of the eruption on human populations. Because the Horn of Africa is one of the regions where Homo sapiens is believed to have persisted through the eruption event. Similarly, research led by Francesco Berna at Border Cave in South Africa, also published in 2025, identified Toba cryptotephra in archaeological sediments dating to the period of the eruption. Border Cave in the Lebombo Mountains of South Africa had been occupied by anatomically modern humans for at least 200,000 years before the Toba eruption, and the presence of cryptotephra in its sediments provides direct evidence of atmospheric fallout from the eruption reaching this southern African refuge site. These cryptotephra findings matter for understanding the Toba catastrophe, not primarily because they confirm the eruption's global reach, that was already well established from macroscopic ash deposits, but because they tie the eruption to the specific locations where we have archaeological evidence of human occupation before, during, and after the event. The great challenge in assessing the Toba eruption's impact on human populations has always been the difficulty of linking the geological record of the eruption to the archaeological record of human behavior. Cryptotephra provides a precisely datable chemical marker that can be found in the same sediment sequences as the stone tools and other artifacts that document human occupation, allowing researchers to correlate eruption timing with archaeological evidence of population continuity or disruption. The question that the cryptotephra research was designed to address, and that the May 2026 study published in Science Daily explicitly revisits, is whether the Toba eruption caused the human population bottleneck recorded in modern human DNA, or whether the genetic evidence for a bottleneck is unrelated to the volcanic event. The genetic evidence for a severe population bottleneck in the history of modern humans is one of the most striking findings of the genomic era. When researchers compare the genetic diversity of Homo sapiens with that of other great apes, the contrast is startling. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have substantially greater genetic diversity than humans, despite having a much smaller total population size. Gorillas, bonobos, and orangutans also show greater genetic diversity than humans in many analyses. This low genetic diversity in humans is paradoxical from an evolutionary perspective, because genetic diversity normally accumulates over time as mutations occur and as populations living in different environments accumulate different genetic variants. A species with the global distribution and long evolutionary history of Homo sapiens should, in theory, be far more genetically diverse than it actually is. The explanation that population geneticists have developed for this paradox is that at some point in the relatively recent past, recent in evolutionary terms, meaning within the past few 100,000 years, the total human population was reduced to a very small number of individuals. This small founding population had limited genetic diversity, and despite subsequent population growth and expansion, the genetic variation lost in the bottleneck was never fully recovered. The genetic diversity present in all living humans today reflects not the full potential diversity of our species, but the subset of diversity that survived the bottleneck event. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material inherited exclusively through the maternal line, used to reconstruct maternal lineage histories, and of Y chromosome DNA, inherited exclusively through the paternal line, have been used to estimate the timing and severity of this bottleneck. The most widely cited estimates suggest that the effective breeding population of Homo sapiens, the number of individuals actually contributing to reproduction in each generation, as distinct from the total number of individuals alive, may have dropped to between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding pairs at some point between approximately 60,000 and 100,000 years ago. The central estimate in many studies is approximately 3,000 to 5,000 breeding individuals, fewer people than the population of a small town, constituting the entire reproductive potential of our species at its most vulnerable moment. The tool that made this discovery possible, the technology that allowed scientists to read the genetic memory of the Toba catastrophe in modern human DNA, deserves a moment of explanation because it is one of the most remarkable scientific achievements of the past half-century, and because understanding how it works makes the bottleneck evidence far more compelling than the bare numbers suggest. Mitochondrial DNA is a small, circular piece of genetic material, approximately 16,000 base pairs compared to the 3 billion base pairs of nuclear DNA, that sits not in the cell nucleus, but in the mitochondria, the organelles that generate the cell's energy. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is inherited from both parents through a complex shuffling process that mixes maternal and paternal genetic material in every generation, mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. Your mitochondrial DNA is essentially identical to your mother's mitochondrial DNA, which is essentially identical to her mother's, and so on back through an unbroken chain of maternal ancestors. The only changes that occur in mitochondrial DNA over generations are random mutations, errors in the copying process that accumulate at a roughly measurable rate over time. This property makes mitochondrial DNA extraordinarily useful for tracing evolutionary history. Because it passes unchanged from mother to child except for occasional mutations, and because those mutations accumulate at a rate that can be calibrated against geological and archaeological evidence, the mitochondrial DNA of living people can be used to reconstruct the lineage history of the human maternal line. To trace every living human's maternal ancestry back through time, generation by generation, to a single ancestral woman. This ancestral woman, known popularly if somewhat misleadingly as mitochondrial Eve, is not the only woman alive at the time she lived. She is simply the woman from whom all living human beings today inherit their mitochondrial DNA through an unbroken maternal chain. She lived in Africa, and genetic analyses consistently place her somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The evidence for the bottleneck comes not from the existence of mitochondrial Eve, but from the shape of the mitochondrial DNA family tree. The branching pattern of lineages that connects all living humans to their common maternal ancestor. In a population that has maintained a large, stable size over a long period of time. The family tree has many old, deep branches, reflecting the slow accumulation of mutations in separate lineages over many thousands of generations. In a population that has experienced a severe bottleneck, a dramatic reduction to a small founding group followed by subsequent expansion, the family tree looks different. The branches are few and shallow, reflecting the elimination of old lineages during the bottleneck and the recent divergence of surviving lineages from a small common founding group. Modern human mitochondrial DNA shows exactly this pattern. The family tree has relatively few deep branches, and the divergence times between major lineages cluster in a relatively narrow time window that overlaps with the period of the Toba eruption. The Y chromosome evidence is similarly compelling. Like mitochondrial DNA, the Y chromosome is inherited in a simple, non-recombining way, from father to son, unchanged except for mutations. The most recent common paternal ancestor of all living men, Y chromosomal Adam in the popular nomenclature, is estimated to have lived between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago, also in Africa. The branching structure of the Y chromosome family tree shows the same signs of a bottleneck as the mitochondrial DNA tree, with reduced diversity and a branching pattern consistent with a severe population reduction at approximately the time of the Toba eruption. The discovery that all living humans trace their mitochondrial lineage to a single woman and their Y chromosome lineage to a single man was one of the most disorienting findings of 20th century genetics. It did not mean that the human population was ever reduced to a single couple. The most recent common maternal ancestor and the most recent common paternal ancestor were not contemporaries, and they were each surrounded by thousands of other people at the time they lived. What the finding means is that in the lottery of lineage, the process by which some maternal and paternal lineages survive through the generations and others die out, we were extraordinarily lucky, or extraordinarily close to being unlucky in a more final way. The comparison with other primates makes the extent of the human genetic narrowing viscerally clear. A single community of chimpanzees in the Kibale forest of Uganda contains more genetic diversity in its mitochondrial DNA than exists in the entire human species worldwide. A single troop of gorillas in the Virunga Mountains harbors mitochondrial lineages more ancient and more divergent from each other than any two human lineages drawn from opposite ends of the globe. We are, by the genetic measure of diversity, one of the most homogeneous large mammals on Earth, a species whose genetic variation fits in a surprisingly small box, given our global range and our long evolutionary history. That box was the genetic inheritance bequeathed to us by the few thousand individuals who survived what their world threw at them 74,000 years ago. The alignment of this genetic bottleneck with the 74,000-year date of the Toba eruption is what gave rise to the Toba catastrophe theory, first formally proposed by Stanley Ambrose of the University of Illinois in 1998. Ambrose argued that the volcanic winter following the Toba eruption drove a global collapse of ecosystems that reduced human populations across Africa and Eurasia to isolated refugial groups, creating the genetic bottleneck visible in modern human DNA. The small, isolated populations that survived the volcanic winter then underwent rapid genetic differentiation as they adapted to the challenging post-Toba environment, eventually giving rise to the major genetic lineages that characterize modern human populations on different continents. The Toba catastrophe theory has been one of the most debated hypotheses in human evolutionary biology for the past 25 years. The debate is complex and still unresolved, with significant evidence on both sides, and understanding the current state of the science requires distinguishing between what is known, what is contested, and what the most recent research has added to the picture. What is firmly established is the reality of the Toba eruption and its extraordinary magnitude. The youngest Toba tuff is one of the most precisely dated and most thoroughly characterized events in the geological record of the Quaternary. The volume of material ejected, the distribution of ash deposits, and the geochemical fingerprints of the tephra are all well documented. The eruption happened. It was enormous, and its atmospheric effects would have been severe. What is also firmly established is the reality of the genetic bottleneck in modern human DNA. Some form of severe population reduction occurred in the ancestry of all living humans, and the timing of this reduction broadly overlaps with the period of the Toba eruption. This is not disputed. What is contested is the causal connection between the two events. Beginning in the 2010s, a series of archaeological studies from India, Southern Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula reported evidence of human occupation continuing through the Toba ash layer with apparent cultural continuity. Stone tool assemblages showing no obvious break or decline in sophistication at the time of the eruption. These findings were interpreted by their authors as evidence that human populations were not catastrophically disrupted by the Toba eruption, and that the geological evidence had led researchers to overestimate the severity of the volcanic winter and its biological consequences. Simultaneously, some population geneticists argued that the genetic bottleneck visible in human DNA did not need to be explained by a catastrophic external event at all. Demographic models showed that the observed patterns of human genetic diversity could potentially be explained by the founder effects associated with the out-of-Africa migration. The bottleneck that occurs whenever a small founding population colonizes a new territory, without requiring an additional population crash caused by a volcanic winter. These critiques have not, however, been definitive. The research published by the Science Daily team in May of 2026 synthesizes the most recent data and concludes that the Toba eruption did produce years of darkness and cold that affected human populations globally, while emphasizing that the response of human populations was more varied and more resilient than the most catastrophic versions of the bottleneck hypothesis had implied. The picture that emerges from this synthesis is not one of uniform global near-extinction, but of regionally variable impact. Some populations devastated, others surviving with remarkable adaptability, and the global genetic bottleneck, reflecting the cumulative effect of regional population, collapses rather than a single global extinction event. The regions where human populations appear to have survived most successfully through the Toba event are the coastal refugia of Africa. The Toba eruption would have had its most severe effects in the regions closest to the eruption center: Sumatra, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia, where the combination of direct ash fall, acid rain, and volcanic winter cooling would have been most intense. Populations in these regions that are documented archaeologically before the eruption appear to disappear from the archaeological record in the period immediately following it. The Indian subcontinent, which had been occupied by anatomically modern humans or their archaic relatives before the eruption, shows a complex pattern, with some sites showing continuity and others showing breaks, suggesting that the impact was severe enough to cause significant disruption, even at large distances from the eruption center. In Africa, the picture is different. The Horn of Africa, the region encompassing modern Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia, appears to have served as one of the primary refugia for Homo sapiens during and after the Toba event. Research led by Christian Tryon of Harvard University and published in March of 2024, working at archaeological sites in the Horn of Africa, documented continuous human occupation through the Toba period, with evidence not of cultural collapse, but of cultural innovation. The stone tool assemblages from sites in this region show the development of new tool types and new lithic technologies in the period around the Toba eruption, consistent with the hypothesis that the stress of the volcanic winter drove innovation rather than simply causing extinction. The coastal hypothesis for human survival through the Toba bottleneck builds on a broader argument about the importance of marine resources for early modern human populations. The archaeological evidence for the exploitation of shellfish and other marine resources at African coastal sites during the Middle Stone Age, the broad cultural period that includes the Toba event, suggests that coastal populations had access to a food resource that was less severely disrupted by the volcanic winter than terrestrial food webs. Marine ecosystems, buffered by the thermal mass of the ocean, would have been less immediately affected by atmospheric cooling than terrestrial ecosystems, and the shellfish and fish that constituted a significant fraction of the diet of coastal African populations would have continued to be available even during the most severe phase of the volcanic winter. To understand what survival actually looked like, what it meant in concrete human terms to be one of a few thousand people keeping our species alive through years of volcanic winter, requires an act of imaginative reconstruction that the archaeological record, for all its gaps and silences, partially enables. The groups that survived were small. The total effective breeding population of Homo sapiens at the nadir of the bottleneck, the moment when our species was at its most reduced, was somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals spread across an entire continent. These people were not gathered in one place. They were scattered across the refugia of coastal and highland Africa in groups that may have numbered anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred individuals, separated from other surviving groups by distances of hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Each group was, for practical purposes, alone. Being alone in this sense meant something very specific for the survival of the species. When a group is small and isolated, the loss of any individual is proportionally significant in a way that it is not in large populations. The death of a skilled hunter, an experienced elder, a woman of reproductive age, or a person who held crucial knowledge about the location of water sources or the behavior of prey animals, was a loss that a group of 30 could not easily absorb. The fragility of small groups is not simply a matter of genetic diversity, though the genetics matter, but of knowledge. Human survival depends on the transmission of accumulated knowledge across generations, and the death of knowledge holders in small groups creates gaps in the chain of transmission that can be catastrophic. The coastal refugia that sustained the surviving populations of the post-Toba world were not comfortable places. The volcanic winter had disrupted the monsoon system that normally delivered predictable rainfall to the Horn of Africa and the southern African coast, making even the more sheltered refugia drier and colder than they had been in living memory. The large herbivores that had formed the primary prey base for earlier generations of hunters, wildebeest, zebra, buffalo, had been severely reduced in the hinterland by the collapse of the grassland vegetation, forcing coastal populations to rely more heavily on the marine and intertidal resources that the coast provided. Shellfish, the mussels, limpets, whelks, and other mollusks that colonize the intertidal rock platforms of the African coast are a food resource of extraordinary reliability. They do not migrate seasonally. They do not require the coordinated effort of a group hunt. They are accessible to anyone, children, the elderly, the injured, who can walk to the water's edge at low tide. Their caloric value is not as high per unit weight as red meat, but they are a consistent, predictable source of protein and essential micronutrients, zinc, iodine, omega-3 fatty acids that are critical for brain development and immune function. The shell middens that mark the sites of early modern human coastal occupation in southern Africa, enormous accumulations of discarded shells at sites like Pinnacle Point, Blombos Cave, and Clayses River mouth on the southern tip of Africa are the material record of this coastal survival strategy operating over tens of thousands of years. At Pinnacle Point, excavated by Curtis Marion of Arizona State University, the evidence for coastal shellfish exploitation dates back to approximately 164,000 years ago, long before the Toba eruption, suggesting that the coastal survival strategy was already well established in the human behavioral repertoire when the eruption struck. The people who exploited these coastal resources in the post-Toba world were not inventing a new way of life in response to catastrophe. They were intensifying and refining a strategy that their predecessors had already developed, drawing on an inherited knowledge of tides and seasons and species distributions that had been accumulated over generations. The cognitive and social demands of the coastal lifestyle may themselves have contributed to the behavioral innovations that appear in the archaeological record of the post-Toba period. Successful shellfish harvesting requires knowledge of tidal cycles, an understanding of the relationship between the moon, the tides, and the optimal time to visit specific intertidal zones. It requires the ability to anticipate future states of the environment, to plan ahead in a way that more opportunistic foraging strategies do not demand. And at the most productive sites, the shellfish beds would have attracted multiple groups simultaneously, creating the social pressures and the social opportunities that drove the development of more complex forms of communication, alliance, and exchange. The ochre that appears in abundance at post-Toba African archaeological sites, the red and yellow iron oxide pigments that were ground, mixed, and applied to surfaces or to human skin, may be one of the most visible signatures of this social complexity. Ochre has many practical uses. It can be mixed with adhesives to haft stone tools, used as a sunscreen, added to organic materials to retard bacterial decay. But its use as a pigment, its application to rock surfaces and to human bodies, is almost certainly related to symbolic communication, to the marking of group identity, to the visual codes that allow individuals in complex social networks to signal their affiliations and intentions. The surge in ochre, use that is visible in the African archaeological record of the period around, and following the Toba eruption, may represent the material trace of a social revolution, driven by the pressures of survival in small, isolated groups that needed to maintain cooperative relationships with other groups. Neighbors who were simultaneously potential allies in times of scarcity and potential competitors for the limited resources of the coastal refugia. Imagine a group of perhaps 40 people, men, women, children, elders, camped on a rocky promontory above a tidal platform on the coast of what is now South Africa. It is nighttime. The fire is small. Wood is scarce in the post-Toba landscape, and fires attract attention. The sky above is clearer than it was 2 years ago, when the stratospheric aerosol veil was at its thickest. But it is still paler and dimmer than the sky that the oldest members of the group remember from before the darkness came. The ocean below is cold, colder than it should be for this latitude. The large marine mammals that used to be common along this coast, now rarely seen. These people are making decisions every day that determine whether the species continues. Not through any grand strategy or conscious awareness of their role in evolutionary history. They have no concept of species or bottleneck or DNA, but through the accumulation of small decisions: which beach to visit tomorrow, whether to share food with the group that appeared on the horizon 2 days ago, whether to teach the children the new method of hafting blades that one of the younger hunters has been experimenting with, whether to use the red ochre to mark the body of the boy who came of age this season, continuing a tradition whose meaning no one in the group could fully articulate, but everyone understood to be important. These are the people whose mitochondrial DNA is in your cells. Their decisions, mundane, daily, made without any knowledge of their cosmic significance, determined whether the chain of transmission that connects them to you was maintained or broken. They survived not because they were stronger or smarter than the populations that perished, but because they were in the right place, exploiting the right resources with the right combination of knowledge and flexibility at the moment when the right decisions happened to be made. And through them, through the fragile thread of human succession that their survival maintained, everything that came after became possible. The small, isolated populations that survived the Toba bottleneck were not simply passive victims of a catastrophe. They were active agents of their own survival, and the evidence for this agency is preserved in the archaeological record of the African refugia. New tool types. particularly the development of microlithic technology, in which small, geometrically regular stone blades are hafted into composite tools with greater efficiency and versatility than earlier large flake technologies, appear in the archaeological record of several African sites in the period following the Toba eruption. The emergence of these more sophisticated technologies, precisely when populations were under maximum stress, is consistent with the hypothesis that the stress of the Toba bottleneck drove the behavioral innovations that would eventually enable Homo sapiens to expand out of Africa and colonize the rest of the world. The genetics and the archaeology point in the same direction. Small, isolated, stressed populations innovate faster than large, comfortable ones. The Toba bottleneck may have been the pressure that made us modern. The behavioral and cultural analogue of this genetic drift may explain something that has puzzled archaeologists for decades: the apparently sudden emergence of fully modern behavioral complexity, art, symbolism, complex social networks, long-distance trade, in the archaeological record of the late Middle Stone Age and early Later Stone Age of Africa. For most of the period from 200,000 years ago to approximately 80,000 to 60,000 years ago, anatomically, modern humans appear to have been present in Africa, but to have lacked the full suite of behavioral innovations that characterize fully modern human behavior. This behavioral modernity appears to emerge, not uniformly or smoothly, but in bursts, in the period that overlaps with the aftermath of the Toba eruption and the subsequent demographic recovery. Whether this is causal or coincidental remains an active area of research. But the hypothesis that the stress and isolation of the Toba bottleneck functioned as an evolutionary crucible, burning away genetic and cultural diversity while simultaneously selecting intensely for adaptability, social complexity, and technological innovation, remains one of the most provocative ideas in the study of human origins. The demographic recovery following the Toba bottleneck, whenever it began in earnest, eventually produced one of the most dramatic expansions in the history of our species. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that by approximately 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, shortly after the Toba eruption in geological terms, small groups of Homo sapiens were beginning to move out of Africa for the first time in large numbers, following coastal routes along the southern rim of Asia, reaching South Asia and Southeast Asia within relatively few generations, and eventually reaching Australia by approximately 65,000 years ago. The speed and geographical reach of this out-of-Africa expansion is itself a testament to the behavioral and cognitive capabilities of the post-Toba human populations. These were not the cautious, small group movements of a species hugging familiar coastlines. They were the migrations of a species that had developed, in the crucible of the Toba bottleneck, the social, technological, and cognitive tools needed to colonize new environments rapidly and successfully. The question of whether Neanderthals survived the Toba event is directly relevant to the subsequent history of the human species. Neanderthals were well established in Europe and Western Asia at the time of the Toba eruption, and the Toba ash layer has been documented in some European sediment sequences, though at much lower concentrations than in sites closer to the eruption center. Climate models suggest that the volcanic winter effects would have been severe in Europe and Central Asia, where Neanderthals were the dominant hominid. If Neanderthal populations in Eurasia were severely reduced by the Toba event, as some models suggest, This would have created the demographic conditions for the subsequent successful expansion of Homo sapiens into Eurasia approximately 60,000 to 40,000 years ago, at a time when the Neanderthal populations that had dominated these regions for 300,000 years were already depleted and fragmented. The Toba eruption may have cleared the ecological and demographic space into which our ancestors expanded when they eventually left Africa. The modern implications of the Toba story extend beyond evolutionary history. The Toba volcanic system is not extinct. Lake Toba sits within a caldera underlain by an active magmatic system. The central island of Samosir, which has been uplifting for thousands of years as the magma chamber beneath it gradually refills, is direct evidence that the geologic engine responsible for the Toba supervolcano is still operating. A recent study published in the journal Nature Geoscience mapped the subsurface structure of the Toba magmatic system in extraordinary detail using modern seismic imaging techniques, revealing a complex multi-level system of magma reservoirs extending from the deep crust to relatively shallow depths beneath the caldera floor. The shallower reservoirs contain partially molten rock, a magmatic mush rather than a fully liquid magma. And the deeper reservoirs are thought to be the primary source of fresh magma input that would eventually feed any future super-eruption. The question of when Toba might erupt again is unanswerable. The question of what would happen if any supervolcano erupted today is not. And the answer to the second question is what makes the first question matter. The most personal dimension of the Toba story is one that modern genomic science has made increasingly concrete. The mitochondrial DNA carried by every living human being today traces back through the maternal line to a founding population that lived in Africa at approximately the time of the Toba eruption. All living humans are more closely related to each other than we are to chimpanzees, not just because we share a common ancestor in the deep evolutionary past, but because we share a common ancestor in the comparatively recent past. A small group of individuals whose survival through or immediately after the Toba bottleneck determined who we would be. The genetic variation that exists among the 7 billion people alive today, the variation that produces differences in skin color, eye color, disease susceptibility, and thousands of other biological traits, is the variation that survived whatever winnowing event reduced our ancestors to their minimum number. This is the deepest implication of the Toba story, and the one that makes it not merely scientifically interesting, but personally relevant to every person alive today. You are the descendant of the survivors. Your genome carries the scars of the bottleneck, the reduced diversity that indicates how close to extinction your lineage came 74,000 years ago. And it also carries the adaptations that your ancestors evolved in the aftermath, the genetic tools they developed under extreme stress that eventually enabled them to colonize the entire planet. Every human being alive today is connected to every other human being by a common ancestry that traces back through the genetic bottleneck to a small group of people on the coast of Africa who survived years of darkness and cold and ecological collapse and kept going. Stand anywhere on Earth today and look at the people around you. They are your relatives. Not in the vague metaphorical sense that all life on Earth is connected by common descent from the first organisms. In the precise genetic sense that all living humans share a common ancestral population small enough to fit in a stadium that lived approximately 74,000 years ago in the aftermath of the largest volcanic eruption in the history of our species. The genetic distance between any two humans chosen at random from anywhere on the planet is smaller than the genetic distance between two chimpanzees chosen from the same troop in a single forest in Central Africa. That genetic proximity is not poetry. It is the molecular trace of a shared catastrophe 74,000 years ago. The Toba eruption was not the end of the human story. It was, in a very real geological and genetic sense, the beginning of the one we are still living. The small, isolated populations that survived the volcanic winter carried within them the seeds of every culture, every language, every civilization that has existed since. The behavioral innovations that stress and isolation drove in those surviving populations, the social complexity, the symbolic thinking, the technological creativity, were the innovations that eventually produced agriculture and writing and cities and science, and the knowledge to look back 74,000 years and understand what happened to us. We survived because our ancestors were resilient, adaptive, and lucky. We know we were lucky because the genetic evidence tells us how close the call was. And we know we were adaptive because the archaeological evidence shows us not passive victims of catastrophe, but active innovators responding to crisis with creativity. The Toba story is not a story of near extinction. It is a story of the conditions under which our species became what it is, and a reminder that the capacities that allowed us to survive a supervolcanic winter 74,000 years ago are the same capacities that we will need to navigate whatever geological and ecological challenges the future of this planet holds. The direct relevance of the Toba event to the present and future deserves more than passing mention, because the geological forces that produced Toba are not historical artifacts. They are active systems operating on timescales that intersect with human civilization. Lake Toba today is a place of extraordinary beauty, a vast, cool highland lake surrounded by the traditional lands of the Batak people, whose culture and history extend back thousands of years in the shadow of a volcano they have always known as sacred and dangerous. The lake covers approximately 1,100 square kilometers, making it the largest lake in Southeast Asia and the largest volcanic lake in the world. Its surface sits at approximately 900 meters above sea level in the highlands of North Sumatra, surrounded by steep caldera walls and the terraced rice paddies and coffee plantations that make this one of the most agriculturally productive highland regions in Indonesia. Approximately 8 million people live in the vicinity of Lake Toba today. Hundreds of millions more depend on the agricultural and hydrological systems of Sumatra and the surrounding region. The magmatic system beneath Lake Toba is monitored continuously by the Indonesian Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation. The monitoring network records frequent small earthquakes generated by the movement of fluids and magma in the subsurface, and GPS sensors on Samosir Island, the large island in the center of the lake that has been uplifting at rates of several millimeters per year for decades, record the gradual inflation of the caldera as the magma chamber below it slowly replenishes. None of these signals indicate an imminent eruption on a super-eruptive scale. Volcanologists consistently assess the Toba system as producing far more significant risk from smaller Plinian-scale eruptions in the near term than from another supervolcanic event in any humanly relevant timeframe. But the broader lesson of Toba, that supervolcanic eruptions occur on Earth's surface with enough regularity to have profoundly shaped the history of our species, applies not just to Toba, but to the several other supervolcanic systems that are currently active or potentially capable of super-eruptive events. The Yellowstone caldera in Wyoming, the most famous supervolcano in public consciousness, sits above a magmatic system fed by the same kind of deep mantle plume that feeds the Hawaiian hotspot, and has produced 3 super-eruptions in the past 2.1 million years, the most recent approximately 640,000 years ago. The Campi Flegrei caldera in the Bay of Naples, which last erupted in 1538, sits beneath one of the most densely populated regions in Europe and has shown accelerating ground deformation and increased seismicity in recent years, leading to elevated alert levels. The Long Valley caldera in California, the Aira caldera in Japan, and the Taupo volcanic zone in New Zealand are among the other supervolcanic systems that scientists monitor for signs of renewed activity. The probability of a Toba-scale supereruption occurring anywhere on Earth in the next 1,000 years is extremely low. Estimates typically range from less than 1% per century for the largest magnitude events. But extremely low probability over human timescales does not mean impossible, and the consequences of a Toba-equivalent eruption today would be categorically different from the consequences of the same event 74,000 years ago. Not because the volcanic forces would be different, but because the civilization that would experience them is different. A Toba-equivalent eruption today would occur in a world of 8 billion people, almost entirely dependent for survival on an agricultural system that requires predictable growing seasons, adequate rainfall, and stable temperatures. The volcanic winter following a modern Toba eruption would disrupt agricultural production on a global scale for multiple years. The global food system, which operates with approximately 60 to 90 days of stored grain reserves at any given time, would be unable to buffer a disruption lasting years rather than months. The cascading effects, famine, mass migration, economic collapse, political instability, and the unraveling of the international systems that currently distribute food and energy globally, would be of a magnitude that no modern civilization has experienced or planned for. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an argument for the value of geological knowledge. Understanding what happened 74,000 years ago, understanding the mechanisms of supervolcanic eruptions, the dynamics of volcanic winters, the resilience and vulnerability of biological populations under extreme stress, is directly relevant to the preparedness of human civilization for the low probability but high consequence geological events that are as much a part of Earth's future as they are of its past. The survivors of the Toba bottleneck had no warning. They had no understanding of what was happening to their world. They had no tools for modeling the future, no institutions for coordinating a collective response, no accumulated knowledge of volcanic winters from which to learn. They survived through individual and small group adaptability, through the exploitation of refugia that happened by geographical fortune to be less severely affected, and through the behavioral and cognitive flexibility that had been evolving in the African hominin lineage for hundreds of thousands of years. Their survival was, in the deepest sense, a product of the qualities that make us human. We have something they did not. We have the knowledge of what happened to them. We have the geological record of the Toba ash layer, the genetic record of the bottleneck in human DNA, the archaeological record of the behavioral innovations that the crisis drove. We have the scientific tools to monitor the supervolcanic systems that could produce similar events in the future. We have the capacity, if we choose to exercise it, to understand our geological environment well enough to prepare for its most extreme possibilities. The DNA in your cells carries the memory of the Toba bottleneck. It carries the memory of the survivors, of the small groups of humans on the coasts of Africa who lived through years of darkness and cold and ecological collapse and continued to exist, to innovate, to teach their children, to build the social and technological foundations of everything that came after. That memory is not accessible to conscious experience. You cannot remember what your ancestors endured 74,000 years ago. But it is there, encoded in the genetic sequence that was passed from those survivors through every generation to you. The reduced diversity in your mitochondrial DNA, the particular variants of immune-related genes that appear in populations from different continents, the specific patterns of genetic relatedness that connect you to every other living human being. These are the molecular signatures of the Toba event. You are, in a very precise sense, made of survival,